Right, so Kira, would you like to start in that case, do you think? Introduce people and tell us what order we're going to have them in.
Well, I was thinking we could start with Marianna's, if that's okay with you, Marianna. And she is a sports science master's student, and she's going to speak about stress as an athlete-environment interaction. And yeah, I'm really excited to hear about your model. And I've seen the preview of the slides, and there's some very interesting use of clip art and goldfish. So
thank you. Okay, I will try to share with you my screen. That is always one of the most difficult parts. Okay. So, first of all, I would like to say that I'm pleased to be here, and it's a pleasure for me being able to present my research to you. And for this reason, I would like to thank Elizabeth for having invited me, and Kira for having organized the session. My name is Marianna Bottiglieri. I'm a PhD student of the Department of Sport and Exercise Science. I'm at the second year of my PhD, and but I was a former clinical psychologist in Italy, and then, as you can imagine, my research then is in the field of sport and exercise psychology. Despite this can suggest a lot of action, instead, my research is pretty theoretical. It has a great theoretical component, and in particular, I'm trying to integrate different theoretical frameworks to build a model of stress that explains why some people react differently to stress under pressure. So a brief introduction of what I mean when I talked about stress in a psychological perspective. The first studies of stress were made by an endocrinologist that is called Dan Selly, and he described stress as an adaptive biological process. In particular, it is the process with which the organism activates itself in presence of dangerous stimuli. It is an adaptive process, but when prolonged, it can lead the organism to exhaustion. What I would like to pay attention on at this point is that from the first based on the first approaches of stress, the relationship between stress and response was linear, but when the psychological perspective was introduced, this linearity was lost for two main reasons. The first is that people can differently appraise situations of stress. And so what can generate anxiety in me can generate feelings of challenge in another person. And we call these different interpretations appraisals. And the second reason is that we can react to stress, decreasing it or increasing it with some strategies that we call coping strategies. We call these actions coping strategies. Now, interpretations and actions can influence future feelings of stress. An example can be the anxiety pre-match, for instance. If I am anxious before a sport match, my feelings of anxiety could lead me to fail. And if I fail, my action will lead me to appraise the same situation with more anxiety the next time. So from a psychological perspective, the relationship between stress and outcome is not linear anymore, it is circular. So it is important to understand each of these elements to intervene and to break the negative circles or to reinforce the positive circles in the stress process. And that's why I decided to study stress in the athletes and in general in situations on performance, and particularly I want to understand why people react to stress in different ways. And for doing this, I decided to study each of the elements of the circle, identifying some theoretical frameworks for each of them to integrate to understand the process. We say that we should have a context, then a stressor, a contextual stressor. We should have individuals that have different characteristics. We can have different interpretations of stress that we call appraisals, and we have different actions. The first part of my research just took into consideration the first three elements, and I will illustrate the theoretical frameworks I've integrated. For identifying contextual stressors, I related on a theory that is called basic psychological needs theory. This theory is developed in the field of motivation, and it distinguished between three innate and universal needs that humans seek to satisfy. These are autonomy, that is the need of perceiving that our action is self-directed, then nobody is controlling us. The feeling of competence, the need, sorry, of competence is the need of perceiving that we are making good the action we are doing. And the feeling of relatedness is the need of having important, significant relationships in our environment. When these needs are satisfied, usually people experience well-being and positive feelings and internalize motivation. But there are situations that can undermine, that actively undermine these feelings. For instance, think about the pressure environment where we are pushed in acting in some ways. Think about situations of negative feedback where we feel incompetent. Think about situations of exclusion or situations of personal detachment where our desire of relatedness is undermined. Because these needs are considered innate and universal, these kind of situations are considered by many stressful, objectively stressful. So I tried to understand how people react to these stressors, to situation of incompetence, lack of control, and unrelatedness. But stressors can be differently appraised by people. And to understand different interpretations, I relied on another framework that is called a theory of challenge and threat states. It claims that under pressure and such as situation of performance, we can interpret stress as a challenge to overcome or as a threat. When we have feelings of challenge, we feel that we can cope with the difficulties because our resources match the situational demands. And then we experience positive emotions, and usually we experience also a good performance. In contrast, when we interpret the stress as a threat, we feel overwhelmed by the difficulties, and so we experience maladaptive outcomes in terms of emotions, but also in terms of performance. The peculiarity of this model is that challenge and threat states were hypothesized also being distinct by different cardiovascular patterns. So usually they are measured both with self-report and with the measurement of cardiovascular indices. So in my model, I wanted to see whether people perceived the situation of incompetence, lack of control, and unrelatedness as a challenge or as a threat. But we are considering different individuals. So my question was, can personal factors influence this perception? And so I decided to study personality among all the personal characteristics that there are available. Probably because personality is a stable construct usually over time and situations, but also because in literature, some personality traits have been demonstrated being sensitive to particular aspects of the context, such as lack of relatedness, autonomy, or competence. And they are also being demonstrated influence the reaction that people have to stress. So I wanted to test if personality could influence the interpretation of these contextual stressors as a challenge or as a threat. To test these, my first data collection was led on students and not on athletes because I needed to test some preliminary theoretical hypotheses. The study was led in a period of COVID-19 restrictions in December, so I was able, despite these, to have the data of 56 students. The the experiment was part of their voluntary teaching activities, so they could choose to participate. As experiment, they compiled the personality questionnaire and another activity led in the laboratory of physiology in Maiden Castle. As you can see, there were some restrictions in place. Then, as you can see from the pictures, we had screens, visors, masks, gloves, etc. The task, the experimental task, for the experimental task, we asked students to deliver an academic presentation in front of me. I'm also the tutor of some seminars of sports psychology. So we asked them to prepare an academic presentation about anxiety and confidence to discuss with me. The presentation was not assessed, but students knew that they could receive feedback about it. So to be sure that they perceived it as a performance. And during this presentation, during this activity, what students did not know is that my actions and my words were manipulated to induce in them a sense of lack of autonomy, incompetence, and unrelatedness. It was a tested protocol in literature, and furthermore, at the end, they had the briefing stage, so to be sure that they were not mistreated or too much stressed out. But during the presentation, for instance, to induce the lack of autonomy, I used the directive language. I give them orders. I used forms like, you should do this, you have to do this. I gave them negative feedback about their presentation. In a couple of points, I told them that it was wrong, also when they were right. And I tried to be personally detached. I tried to appear distracted. I looked somewhere else while they were talking. I didn't call them by name, but with the number of their assigned to them as participants. During the academic presentation, their cardiovascular indices were measured with a non-invasive device and with a blood pressure monitor to obtain also the physiological indices of challenge and threat. And at the end of the presentation, their perception of needs thwarting or needs frustration, their perception of lack of autonomy, incompetence, and personal detachment was assessed. The hypothesis was that in presence of perception of needs frustration, they experienced challenge or threat states during the presentation based on their personality factors. I had some specific hypotheses. For instance, I believed that extroverted people could be more vulnerable to unrelatedness that are compared to other personality factors, and then being in a threat state. At the moment, I'm still at the stage of analysis, but we have some complex partial results that are not in the direction of my hypothesis. They confirm the role of personality, but in a different way of how I hypothesized. And for instance, I have found that people with high levels of extraversion instead experienced the challenge state during the presentation in presence of feelings of unrelatedness and incompetence. This could suggest a protective role of extraversion in presence of specific stressors. And then when people feel incompetent, is made feel incompetent, or people perceive personal detachment, being extroverted could protect them from negative stress. It was not expected, and furthermore, there is a part of this graph that is the initial part that is not so clear, but as you can see, the TPR reaction is an index of threat, and so when it is high, we are in a threat state. When it is low, we are in a challenge state. People with high extraversion, when they perceived the relatedness thwarting, they were in a challenge state, vice versa, for people with low extraversion, and the same for the perception of competence thwarting. So what I will do now will be clarifying better some results of my analysis and continuing the analysis I'm finishing. But there is material to hypothesize that some personality factors can have risk can be a risk or protective factors in presence of particular stressors, and this could inform some training or intervention techniques made by professionals such as sports psychologists in particular environments. But in future developments of my research, I would like to test this model in more ecological situations, such as the athletic performance. Okay, thank you for your participation and for having had the courage of listening me. If there are any questions, I would be glad to answer.
Hi, Marianna. That was brilliant. Sorry, Ewan. Go ahead.
No, you go.
No, you seem itching. No, it's fine. I was just wondering how you thought the influence of like COVID may have affected that gathering of data phase where you were doing these, doing the in front of you because of the the masks or the visors. Did they maybe interact with that kind of impersonal aspect that you were trying on some groups or not?
Yeah, I think that it influenced the procedure. For instance, we have some strange results. And I would like, over these months, we are taking into consideration also the influence of this context on the results we are obtaining. Initially, what I have noticed is that probably, okay, in some ways, these COVID restrictions facilitated the work I was doing, because you can understand that the lack of control that I wanted was increased by the use of masks, gloves, visors, etc. But on the other hand, I couldn't manipulate my actions as I wanted, because there were some things to consider. For instance, for the placement of the electrodes, I should be extremely careful to not be in touch with them, to always using gloves. Then I was extremely kind in the first stages of the experiment, and also people talked to me. They told that it was finally good to be out of the house, to do something different, and I had the same feeling. And it was pretty hard to not empathize. And furthermore, I had to lead by myself all the stages of the experiment. So I had to place the electrodes, I had to host them, lead them to the laboratory, because nobody else could. We should just be in touch one by one. And so they perceived me first kind and then threatening. And it was hard to induce also sometimes the feeling of incompetence and relatedness and autonomy. It affected my research, yes, I would say in a great extent, but it was good to be able to complete the procedure and also to have some significant results.
I think it just shows the resilience of our departments working around COVID, and it seems like, yeah, you managed really well. So congrats.
Thanks for the presentation. It was really good. I just wanted to ask, how did you designate people as extroverted or less extroverted? Was it just self-report? Or?
Yes, a questionnaire self-report. I relied on a model that is called Big Five model. It assesses 5 personality traits that are extroversion, consciousness, openness, conscientiousness, openness, and yes, so I always miss one, and agreeableness. And yes, and with some scales, with some subscale, with some tested self-report instruments.
Can I ask a very quick question? I saw the word trans theory or trans theoretical on your first, I think it was your first slide. it's a word that's new to me. What do you mean?
It means considering different theoretical contributions. So the research can be transversal to different theoretical approaches.
Sorry, I lost my internet connection then for a crucial minute. Could you tell me again?
That the research is transversal to different theoretical contributions.
Right.
Yes, it contributes to different theoretical approaches. In my case, I integrated 3 different theoretical models that usually are not related.
Okay.
So Marianna, is the implication of your research that people who are introverted are bound to find these things threatening, this process threatening? If you found that the extroverts found it challenging, which I have to say doesn't seem to me entirely surprising from a completely non-sort of technical point of view.
Yes, it does mean that low level of extroversion, yes, introversion could predict a threat state, while extraversion could predict a challenge state in presence of these stressors. Mm-hmm. And in particular, both things are true because we found that the interaction effect was valid.
So does everybody conform to those patterns, or did you have complications of some people not necessarily conforming fully to that kind of connection?
No, probably not. Not all the people. We work with analysis of. We work on probability. It is probable for. We have an error of less than the 5% of 1% that the model don't describe the reality. That these results don't describe the reality. Or at least that we didn't obtain the result casually.
I had a comment and a question. That the comment was that it's an interesting skill to have to pretend to be mean to people. That's something that I've never had to do in my research. So you have to be an actor. I wonder if you found that difficult. But the question I had was, have you considered the relevance of your research to other forms of performance? And the thing that immediately sprang to my mind is musicians who have to do something that's technically very difficult under great pressure, but it doesn't require the same sort of physiological demands as high performance sport. But it strikes me that there is very much that cycle of any kind of flaw in the performance feeding back to make the next one more difficult.
I didn't consider the musician performance. At the moment, I limited my thoughts to academic and sport performance. But being a musician by myself, I would be interested in following your advice.
Did anyone watch the Young Musician of the Year award on television, which was won by a 17-year-old Chinese boy playing the marimba and controlling 6 mallets at a time and playing versions of Beethoven, no, Mark, and other things? I mean, just astonishing performance of control. You can imagine that if you messed that up, it would really, really destroy your confidence for doing it the next time, because it was such a level of precision and complexity. Really amazing, worth watching.
Thank you.
If we don't have any other questions, then it's Ewan Jones's time to shine. He is a Master's Biological Sciences student, and he's going to talk about climate change and the role this has had on plant soil feedback in invasive plant species. Yeah. And you might find Ewan along the river picking up plants for his samples. Anyway, sorry, Ewan, on to you.
Not too often. I try not to get weird looks. Let me just full screen this.
And Ewan is one of our Cuths artists who's got shortlisted for the art prize, the student art prize. So congratulations for that.
Thank you.
Many of you will have seen Ewan's work in previous ArtSoc shows, and we hope we'll see it this summer as well.
Okay. So yeah, I'm looking at how climate change will affect the role of plant soil feedback in plant invasions, specifically in the case of Impatiens glandulifera, which is Himalayan balsam. Don't know if any of you look out for it, but it's everywhere along the river. So first of all, climate change, we've all heard of it, but it's set to get a lot worse in the future. Hopefully not too bad, but most predictions, we've got a few here, in the Northeast, it seems like we'll get on average around 3.5 degrees Celsius warming in the next 50 years. And along with the increased temperature, you'll also get increased carbon dioxide. And the temperature is also, because of the increased carbon dioxide, you also get increased precipitation, increased weather, so both flooding and drought, longer growing season for plants, and also increased plant invasions. But we don't know how climate change will affect plant soil feedbacks. This is kind of quite a hot topic now, or it's becoming one, because we've realized just the extent to which plants affect the soil that they're in and then facilitate the growth of later plants as well. For example, you've got temperature, moisture, you've got top-down control from the plants above soil, and then also what's happening in the roots. And so plant soil feedbacks are, plants altering their surrounding soil and then affecting subsequent plant growth and survival. So this is both through their litter composition, soil microbiome. There are root exudates, so things that the roots release, like extra carbon, and also allelopathy, which is sort of theoretical. It's been documented a few times. My supervisor doesn't really like it. He thinks it's not real, but it's where plants can secrete substances that actually kill surrounding plants. But that's kind of contentious. But what is certain is that invasive plants have been shown to alter soil to facilitate subsequent invasions by both that same invasive plant and also other ones as well. So past research has shown that, invasive plants, as you'd expect, they make better use of increased temperature, water, nutrients, and carbon dioxide, because they're not as limited by these components as native ones. And just to clarify, or as I haven't done this yet, so invasive plants are plants that have come from elsewhere. So in the UK, be non-native plants, basically. And all of these components that invasive plants are more successful at using are linked to climate change. So you would expect to see a difference in invasions in the future. And so this is just a quick figure I came up with to sort of demonstrate it. So with the increases in temperature, carbon dioxide, precipitation, you'll get an increased growth of the invaders compared to the natives, because they just grow so much faster. They make much better use of the nutrients available to them. And that would mean, because they've grown faster, you get more soil litter, increased decomposition, so there's even more nutrients available. That fundamentally changes the soil. Also bacteria, they love decomposing high nutrient rich soil, and so you get increased amounts of those, which the invaders like as well. And then you'll just get you'll have even more invaders growing with all this increased nutrients, etc. And so I'm looking specifically at Himalayan balsam, just because it's so ubiquitous around Durham and the whole of the UK now. You probably recognize it. You see it everywhere. It's got nice flowers, and also the seeds, when you squeeze them, they explode, just go everywhere. And previous studies have shown that when grown in soil that was conditioned, so that has had Himalayan balsam growing in it, the next generation of Himalayan balsam was taller, it produced more leaves, it grew faster, and just in general had higher biomass than those grown in non-conditioned soil. As well, there's arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi, AMF, which basically they're attached to the roots, and they are symbiotic with the plants. They help increase the surface area of the roots so you can get more nutrient uptake, more water. They just aid in drawing all these things into the plant. However, Himalayan balsam doesn't need this arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi, whereas a lot of native plants do. And this study actually found that in conditioned soil, there was only half the amount of arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi root colonization as in the control soil. So it seems like the Himalayan balsam is doing something to maybe kill off, just decrease the amount. And also you had twofold bacterial biomass as well in the conditioned soil. But how will this study just looked at present day temperatures, but we don't know how all of these effects will change in the future with climate change. So one hypothesis is you could have this altered microbial community composition, so decreased mycorrhizal fungi, increased bacteria, and this would change how these things work in the ground. So with the natives that usually use this mycorrhizal fungi to help get more nutrients, more water out of the soil, with climate change and also more invasions, you would already have lots of nutrients, lots of water in the soil. And so in this abundance of nutrients and water, the fungi might actually become parasitic and be detrimental because it takes sugars, etc., from the plant, whereas the invaders don't use this, so they would have no detrimental effects. And then so you'd have even more growth of the invaders and then more invasions in the future. So I wanted to see the effects of increased temperature and varied precipitation on the relative success of invasive plants with a focus on what's happening below ground. The species that I'm looking at for natives, I've got Epilobium jacobea and Silene. Jacobea, I still can't believe that's the actual name of it. It's quite apt. And then also Impatiens is the invasive species. And we've laid them out. This is the first experiment, the temperature one. And so we've laid them out. We've got 3 invaders in the invader pot, the three native species in the community pot. And then we've got both community and invader to check the effect of competition on all of these factors. And then in this 2-phase experiment, I'll only be using the invader and community ones in the next stage because I just want Impatian soil and native soil. So we've got 2 growth chambers in the biology department. And I was given access to this huge data set of hourly temperature in Durham for the past 10 years, just massive. And so I figured out the mean temperature in May and June. June is the red area, May is the blue area. And so we've used this real world data to set the climate chamber temperatures. So it follows a 24-hour cycle. And in the present day one, it directly follows the average hourly temperature in Durham over the past 10 years. And then the future one is simply 3.5 degrees warmer at every point throughout the 24-hour cycle. And so following an 8-week growth regime, which finished 3 weeks ago, did lots of data collection from that. We've now replanted into the pots with 3 natives and an Impatiens, and we'll see after another 8 weeks whether the conditioned ones have grown faster, whether they're bigger, they have more biomass, and also compare between the future and the present temperature chambers. And so yeah, focusing on the pot origin, the species, and temperature. And as you can see, this is from the study I mentioned before. This is just in one temperature, but you can see that the solid dots, those are in conditioned soil, the open ones are in unconditioned, and for both plant height and leaf number, conditioned soil has shown a significant effect. I'm also looking at, this is quite cool, something that you couldn't do until about 5 years ago. I'm extracting DNA from the soil, and I'm going to do sequencing to find out exactly what is present in the soil that is driving any potential differences. So if I do see an effect of conditioning, I can now investigate and see, oh, we've got lots of this species of fungi, this species of bacteria, and this, and then I could make a hypothesis around that as to what is actually driving this effect. Which, yeah, not many people have done. There's been a big push recently, now that we're able to do it much easier and cheaper. But not many studies are utilizing it at the moment. So that's quite cool. And then the next experiment that we're also running concurrently is a flooding one. So Himalayan balsam is a riparian plant, so that's on the riverbanks. And their riverbanks are especially susceptible to plant invasions, just because you got the easy access of the river. For example, Himalayan balsam, the seeds float really well, so they just travel along the river. And also, they are very detrimental to rivers because they're annual plants, so they just grow tons of biomass, and then they all die at the same time, and they really erode the riverbanks. So it's a huge problem, which the native plants don't do. And climate change is predicted to exacerbate the effect of flooding. Of course, you get more flooding and also more drought with this extreme weather. But are invasive species more flood or drought tolerant than natives? And how is this reflected in biomass allocation? So they might grow the same above ground, but in drought, perhaps, do you see the invaders are more effective at putting down deeper roots to get more water? You'd expect it because they're so successful, but it's not entirely sure. So what we've done is we have, how many? 140 pots, quite a few, and 7 watering treatments. So we've got, for example, one is just a constant high of 300 ml. All of these we do water 3 times a week. So constant high, constant medium, constant low. And then treatment 4 is just a medium, and then you get a pulse, so like a flood, and then 5 is the inverse, so medium, and then a drought treatment, and then 6 and 7 are alternating between the two. So this is kind of to see, oh, if you get a flood early on in the plant's life cycle, does that cause greater changes than, say, if you get a flood later, and the inverse with drought as well. And so, yeah, this is what it looks like in our, we've got a greenhouse in the Botanic Gardens. It's quite nice on sunny days, actually. And yeah, in the past, Himalayan balsam has been shown to have low drought tolerance, but quite good flood tolerance. So it's going to be interesting to see, are natives better suited to surviving a drought than the invaders? Are the invaders better at surviving a flood? And yeah, is there any temporal component to this? And also, is there any differences? Are there any differences in biomass allocation? Lots of stuff, yeah, but all just trying to figure out how these issues will be perhaps exacerbated in the future under climate change. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Ewan, that was brilliant. I was just wondering why you chose impatiens. Am I saying that right? Impatiens?
Yeah, impatiens. Yeah.
Impatiens.
I just call it Himalayan balsam. Yeah, just because it's quite a serious one with that really fast growth and then just the dieback. And you can see it on the riverbanks in Durham, actually. Like over the winter, they're just barren because it's all the impatiens have just died out. And now if you go now, you can see, if you just look, it's all Himalayan balsam everywhere. and yeah, it's very different to native plant assemblages at riverbanks.
Were there any other contenders along the riverbanks?
Yeah, we're also, my lab partner, she's looking into giant hogweed, which also has a similar effect. And you can also see those in Durham, but
Don't touch it.
yeah, exactly.
Yes.
It's, it causes
Skin
really bad.
blistering.
Yeah, exactly.
So Ewan, is it yet possible to say that certain native plant species have been completely driven out or on the point of dying out because of these invasive things, or is this just something that people can see sort of in progress and that might happen? It's rather alarming.
So yeah, you can see, I mean, I've only been here 4 years, not a long enough time scale, but you can already see the dominance of Himalayan balsam everywhere that a few years ago you wouldn't have. And we do have recordings of that. We've got a lot of citizen science, everyone going out and marking what's there going back like 50 years. So you can track that. But yeah, it's definitely going to get worse in the future. So it's important that we do the research now to try and see how we can attempt to combat it. Although when it comes to Himalayan balsam, it's just so widespread, it is a monumental task. So, yeah.
Do you know when it first appeared in Britain? I mean, perhaps Bob or Paul know that. How long have people been aware of Himalayan balsam?
I'm not too sure, but I think it might be similar to Japanese knotweed, where the Victorians brought it over. And
yeah, I was going to say it might well be something like that. Many of these invasive species, of course, have been deliberately introduced in the past.
Exactly, yeah.
And not just plants, animals too, things like the grey squirrel, which have displaced the native one.
Spanish bluebells, the wrong kind of bluebell. And does this have implications also for sort of crops and things other than wildflowers, Ewan?
Yeah, I was wondering, Ewan, how your research fits into the general context of invasive species, be they plants, animals, or whatever.
I think it's, of course, it's difficult to generalize with all of these invasive species, but you can see common factors in a lot of them. For example, they just grow very quickly. They have, they often don't have this association with all that the natives have with things like the fungi. And so through these findings, we might be able to predict that, oh, if this area does get warmer, if you get more precipitation, then you might expect, specifically on riverbanks, which is what we're kind of focusing on. Oh, these areas are definitely areas of concern, so we need to focus our priorities on them. Yeah.
You've also got the effects of human intervention in something like the river running through Durham, where there's constant human activity and human work going on.
Exactly.
The introduction of the fencing or whatever it's called, the barriers that were put up not that long ago, just a couple of 2 or 3 years ago. Before that, there was nothing to prevent you sort of walking into the river if you wanted to. Now you can't do that easily. So there's all this kind of thing as well. And I wonder, I can see the importance of your laboratory-based experiments in trying to interpret what's going on in the environment, but the environment's so much more complicated with all that.
In situ observations are also going to be very important. So this is kind of like a microcosm thing, just to see if there is this effect of the soil microbiome, arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi, things like that. But yeah, definitely a larger scale experiment. Just at a plot near the river, that would be very interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Actually, I had a sort of related question, which is you use the mean temperature on a daily cycle, if I understood correctly.
Yeah.
And does that mean that every day was the same for the plants?
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, not exactly what you'd see in real life, but in general, yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, I think that's obviously a very logical place to start. But I was wondering, since obviously the mean is one characteristic of the climate, how much does the standard deviation, so the width of that bar as it goes across the day and from month to month, how much does that matter to the welfare of the plants?
Yeah, I know that's also really interesting. So in this experiment, we were kind of just looking at the baseline temperature and then 3.5 degrees warming. But that would be another interesting thing. So we got like temperature, we've got the flooding thing, and then also looking at heat waves versus like freezing. That would definitely be.
Because I mean, you could imagine having the same average profile, but then a sort of a wider variation about it, and that might have an impact. Yeah,
definitely. They're quite robust, so it would be interesting to see if the invaders are better. Yeah.
I was just wondering, is there any work being done on how to actually help native species recover, and what is being done on, if anything?
Yeah, in terms of the Himalayan balsam problem, it's just so ubiquitous now. It's very, very difficult. What people are looking at is more education to try and prevent something like this happening again. And also if we can understand, for example, with the water, the flooding drought experiment, you can see like at what life stage the invader might be the most vulnerable. So if you can see like, oh, it's very vulnerable to floods at this stage, and you can see, oh, that might be the time when we should go and try for eradication. Although, again, it's just, there's so much, it's probably impossible now. But yeah, it is a difficult one. You've got examples from the past. For example, you have countries that have introduced bugs that are specific predators for those plants. And often they'll work in a very short time frame, and then they'll just start eating everything else. It's very, very difficult issue to solve, but yeah, an interesting one.
Is this a PhD program, Ewan, or what?
Just a research master's.
A research master's. And is this going to lead on to more work in plant science?
I honestly have no idea. I need to figure out what I'm going to do. This was kind of just COVID spurred me to decide to stay one more year in Durham, because I missed out on, I was on the 3-year course, and then I missed out on basically all of the final half of my final year. So I figured, yeah, why not? I'll just stay another year, see what it would be like doing research in a lab, and then decide if I'd like to continue. Yeah.
But there must be all sorts of opportunities, because there's so much going on in genetics and plants, new species, all this kind of thing. So you could go on if you wanted to.
Would be very cool. Yeah. And now all this DNA work is very up to date. Like that's what people are doing in labs nowadays. So yeah.
So you're at the cutting edge.
Yeah, quite cool.
Do you also paint plants and draw plants among your art?
I've done a few, but my lab partner, she's also cuts, and she does quite a few. She likes plants and birds. She paints.
Who is this?
Wana. I'm not sure if you know her.
I know her. No.
Yeah.
No.
I have to coerce her to get her to submit to the art exhibition.
Yeah. No, I will do that.
Okay, well, if there's no other questions, thank you guys so much for a really informative session. And I'm just kind of in awe of how well you explain these concepts that are really technical, and the methodology involved is insanely technical, but I feel like we all got something out of that. I'm speaking on behalf of everybody, but yeah, it was really clear, really well presented, and yeah, amazing. Thanks, guys.
So
thank you all for coming as well.
We'll put the recording up on the JCR YouTube channel, and you may well get more questions from people who weren't able to be here, but discover that it's of interest to them. And we certainly would like to know, I think, how both your research progresses. And Marianna, you're here next year, aren't you?
Yes, hopefully.
Yes, yes. Are you actually physically in Durham, or are you in Italy?
No, I'm in Durham.
You are in Durham, yeah. So, because obviously there's lots, your research is pointing in interesting directions. I'm sure people would like to hear more about that next year. And as you will know, our new principal is a psychologist, although she does slightly different sort of psychology, but nonetheless, she will be interested in those things. So perhaps you'll get invited back. I should be sad not to be here to hear it. But
thank you.
So.